Well, good morning. Welcome back. Thank you for coming back. We are in week 4 of a 6-week cycle of parenting littles. Thanks for hanging in there with us. The last 3 weeks have been weird. You guys weren't here for one of them. I wasn't here last week, but we're thankful that you keep coming back. It's an encouragement to us that you're here. Also, it's much more fun to teach to a room full of people than a room full of chairs. So let's recap really quickly where we've been the last 3 weeks, and then we'll kind of settle in on where we're moving into today. So just as we told you that each session we want to start with biblical principles that govern our parenting and move into practice, the whole course is kind of designed that way too. So you found that we were high into concepts in the beginning. We're moving more into practical pieces, and that means we're moving more into non-convictional things, especially as we get into the next 2 weeks. So we started week 1 with making a case for being intentional with our parenting, not parenting on the fly, and putting our relationship with the Lord first, right? We can't disciple little people if we aren't disciples ourselves. Week 2, we talked about authority. So we talked about how we are a people under authority and how we exercise authority over our kids in our home. And then last week, Paul taught on obedience and parenting the hearts of our kids. And so we're going to really just continue on in with that today. Last week, Paul told you that in our home, we consider obedience is obedience when we obey without challenge, without excuse, and without delay. I say we because we as adults are called to obedience as well. So that's what we use with our kids, without challenge, without excuse, without delay. And so that means even if you do the thing I asked you to do, but you grumbled and you whined and you backtalked or you took forever to do it, it actually wasn't obedient to your parents. So we distilled that down into obedience being right actions and right motives together. And we know, if you have a toddler, you cannot make their motives be right, That's why we teach things like manners, like Paul mentioned. We teach our kids to say please and thank you before they are actually thankful, right? We go ahead and give them the language to use and pray that the Lord will mold their hearts according to the good language we've given them. And so, we have to remember it gets hard when we move into these conversations about disobedience, but we remember that obedience is a good thing. It's how we were created. I taught my kids a catechism when they were little. I don't know if you do New City Catechism, but how and why did God create us? God created man and woman in his image for his glory. That's what I did with my kids when they were little. And so we are created to obey God. Because of that, obedience brings joy in our lives. So that is a phrase that I've used over and over with our kids. Obedience brings joy. So that when we move into conversations about their disobedience, we can talk about the opposite of that. So we want to make sure that we are people that are trustworthy for our kids to obey us, right? We want them to trust that what we're asking of them is for their good, for God's glory, so that they want to obey us because that is the joyful option. So as we move in today to talk about disobedience, we're going to talk about those conversations that show our kids that just as obedience brings joy, disobedience will bring sorrow and pain and sting.
Yeah, so, this lesson comes 4 out of 6, right? And there's a reason for that. Because we kind of built up and talked about assessment of ourselves, setting clear expectations, defining clearly what obedience is. We want to do those things so that when we have discipline and correction and consequence, that in that context, it does what we intend it to do. Right? If you are not setting up clear expectations with our kids and then you drop a hard consequence on them, that just leads to a lot of frustration and anger on their part. It's ineffective, it's not working the way you want it to, and it results in some angry kids, right? If you're not kind of building up into that place. A lot of these early years are spent with our kids, with them forming their worldview, their values, their morals earlier on than we even sometimes realize. And with that, we want to do two things at once. Like we've talked about, having guardrails or being able to fall off the road on either side, and we want to stay in the middle. On one hand, like we want our home to be a place where our kids can fail, where they can mess up,
Fail safely.
fail safely, but at the same time, we want to teach that actions have consequences. And we want them to see consequences and feel consequences in little ways in the house that are way better than the consequences that they face later on. And, to get that down to the practical level, like just to be real honest, like I have personally seen homes where that happened, where like the parents were very much like, hey, I want to do everything I can to love and protect my kids, but the application of that to them was no consequences. And they bailed their kids out in middle school when their grades were bad. They went and fought with the teacher. In high school, when they got suspended for something, the parents went in and fought for the suspension and said, no, they don't deserve it. And honestly, I'm thinking of some family friends in particular when I say this, and their son wound up in jail in his 30s because protected from consequence from childhood to adult. And so I don't say that to scare us into that, but there's an honest realization, like there's sometimes, it's really popular in our culture right now to just focus on particular positives and just behavioral modification of do this and it's good, and there's an absence of both teaching consequence, allowing consequences in natural areas that it's going to happen, or even protecting them from consequences in other facets of life through sports, school, whatever. So again, not saying to drive that out of fear, just acknowledgement of like, we want that to happen in the little ways now, and we straight up have that conversation with ours. Like, hey, this is a consequence. It feels huge now. It's a little one. Like, if dad goes into work and smacks a coworker, like you smacked your sister, like that consequence is huge. And it sounds silly, but like we know, like we want them to see that at a young age. A few years ago, one of the kids came home from Sunday school and they had a card, and I'm not entirely for sure the context of this. All I know that by the time I got it home, it was just a card that said, "Thank you, Dad, for punishing me."
I think you kept it, didn't you?
I did save it somewhere. Like I pull it out when no, I'm just kidding.
Remember what you said.
Remember.
Yeah.
But we want to give our kids the best. And we do strive to do that, but we need to come to the biblical understanding that discipline and love are wrapped up together. It's not you've got to love them and not have discipline. No, we love our children well by biblically disciplining them.
Yeah, so we are going to hold to the fact that we hold high standards for our kids. We understand that our kids are in different states of spiritual awareness, right? Maybe even in this room. Some of our kids are believers and some of them are not. And we do in some way parent differently to our kids that have professed faith. Now you're a follower of Christ. This is what the Lord asks of you. But we are still going to call our kids to obedience even before they profess faith. So we do have to remember, though, that our kids are born lost, right? Our humanity is fallen. And so our kids are born with a fallen sin nature. And so when we expect these things of our kids, which we can, we need to remember that they lack spiritual awareness. They have a lack of wisdom on how to live this life according to God's standards. The Bible has a word for that. It's called foolishness or folly. We'll hear it referred to as folly a lot, especially in the Proverbs. When I was prepping this lesson, I had a Post-it note of like the things I wanted to make sure I said, and Parker saw it on the table, and he said, did I tell you this? He said, why do you have the word fools in all caps circled like 3 times? And he said, are you calling us fools? And I was like, kind of. But the truth is, if you're foolish, you're a fool, right? So we need to remember that our kids' hearts are foolish. They're going to do foolish things, and we can't be caught off guard and surprised by it. Proverbs 22:15. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. So this is the foolishness that makes our kids think they know what's best, that they're always right, and that everything should be about them. You can turn with me, if you'd like, to Psalm 53. I'm too short to see well. Have to tiptoe. Let's go to Psalm 53 for a quick peek about the heart of a foolish person and God's view on that. So Psalm 53, verse 1 says, "The fool says in his heart, there is no God. They are corrupt, doing abominable iniquity. There is none who does good. God looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there are any who understand, who seek after God. They have all fallen away. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who does good, not even one." So we see that a foolish heart is truly no light matter. This is a desperate heart situation. And that's why we talked about the heart last week, because we need to see that our kids have hearts that desperately need rescue, right? As we read this, we should know, well, there is one who does everything perfectly. Our minds should go to Christ. Christ is the example that we have to hold out for our kids. Flip a few books forward for me to Ezekiel. If I can find it myself. Ezekiel 36. This whole section is beautiful. I'm just going to read a little. So Ezekiel 36:26 says, "And I will give you a new heart, and a new spirit I will put within you, and I will remove the heart of stone from your flesh and give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes and be careful to obey my rules." So this foolishness, this heart of stone, this heart that cannot be changed or moved or impacted, this is a heart that needs fixing. This is a heart that needs rescued. And so it's our job to tell our kids how that is possible in Jesus. So it's our job to tell them the gospel over and over and over, many, many different times and in many ways, so that they know how Jesus has offered this to them. And what we'll find is that moments of discipline are a uniquely beautiful way for us to hold out that rescue to our kids.
Sometimes I think we can get this confused a little bit as we practically play it out as parents. We like to say, and we easily fall into the categories of, we like to say, well, that's the loving, kind parent, and that's the one that drops the discipline in the house. But biblically, we just see this tie together between discipline and love, and we're not attempting to give a full theological rundown for any of this stuff, but we do want to hit on a few just scriptures reminding us that this is the way God deals with us, right? God deals with us over and over again. He says in Scripture, discipline and love are tied together. And you don't have to try to turn here, but I'm just going to read a couple. Hebrews 12:6 and 11. "For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and he chastises every son whom he receives." In verse 11, "For the moment, all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it." Proverbs 3:12, "For the Lord reproves whom he loves, as a father the son in whom he delights." Proverbs 13:24, "Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him." Revelation 3:19, "Those whom I love I reprove and I discipline, so be zealous and repent." It's just a repeated theme in Scripture, right? Discipline and love tied in together. It's what God does with us. It's what, as parents, we are called to mirror that in the lives of our kids.
So just like we did with authority that week, sometimes when we're thinking through a concept, it's more helpful, at least on the front end, to think about what it's not. So we're going to go through a few things that discipline should not be, and a few ways that discipline should not look. And you've likely already thought through some of these, but our discipline should not be manipulative with our kids. We should not discipline out of fear. We're not trying to cause shame. We should not be threatening, and our discipline should not be out of bribery, okay? That all seems like common sense, but the truth is it's really hard when we move into practice. So we want to consider discipline that humbles our kids versus discipline that humiliates our kids. Okay, so at the end of a discipline moment, you want your kid walking away with a sense of their fallen nature. Like, my heart truly is not able to follow the Lord apart from Christ. But that is not without hope, right? Our goal is not to humiliate our kids in discipline, and we'll get practical in a few minutes as to how we can, put that into practice. Also, our discipline is not the same as straight punishment, right? We are not disciplining in punitive measures alone. So this is not about, like, you did something that made me mad, I'm gonna spank you. That's not what this is. This is not out of retribution. We're not trying to cause suffering to our kids. This is not an evening of the score. You did this to me, like blow for blow kind of thing. That's not what this is. Our discipline seeks to train and instruct our kids in obedience, and really empowering our kids to control their own choices, their own obedience. We should never discipline out of anger, or frustration. And I said this to Paul so many times this week as we thought through this, and I'm sure I'll say it again because I say it to myself. If we cannot approach a discipline moment without being controlled by our anger, then we should forego the discipline moment, right? I say that to myself. Can you tell I get worked up? The goal in discipline is to correct our kids and restore them, right? Restore them to right relationship with us, whoever they've wronged, and with the Lord, ultimately. And so if we parent according to the things that bother us, like if we only correct according to our own list of pet peeves, that creates inconsistency for our kids. You'll see this, like, you see a parent at the park, and Paul talked about fits last week. The kid's throwing a fit way over there, but the moms are having a real good conversation. I've been there, I know this feeling. And so I don't really want to go address the fit. Good morning. So the kid learns in that moment, right? There's communication that, if I don't act that way right in front of mom, she's going to let it go, right? Our parenting can also not be in terms of our feelings. Our kids cannot bear our emotional burden. Sometimes they can't bear their own. They're not equipped to do that. So this is not, because you've made mommy really mad, now there will be a consequence. Or, it makes me so sad when you do that. We can certainly communicate awareness of others' feelings without placing our emotional burden on them. In past weeks, we've bounced around in Ephesians 6. Let's peek there again. Turn with me if you can. This should be familiar to us by this point. So Ephesians 6, starting in verse 1. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you, and that you may live long in the land. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And so we see here that discipline and instruction must go hand in hand. And that's what we're going to talk about today. This is not discipline for the sake of discipline. It's discipline to restore and instruct in how to live an obedient life. And so we never discipline without talking it through. So it's our job to set up clear expectations. We'll go more into that. It's also our job to make sure we're disciplining with clear expectations. They should never be surprised by the way we respond to their disobedience.
So as we kind of transition to the practical piece of it, if you've ever been over to our house at all, you'll know that I am more of like a cold-blooded pet person. And
okay, I didn't know where you were going with cold-blooded. Sorry.
Like, I like dogs, but I'm not like a crazy, like, I love dog person. Like, and it kind of plays out in how I handle like our dog. Our dog does well for what he is, but I'm horrible at training said dog, right? Like, my view of the dog training is basically like when the dog does something I like, I say, I'll praise it, and then when it does something I don't like, I yell at it. And probably unsurprisingly, the dog's not that great at figuring out what I don't like on a day-to-day basis, right? Like,
Poor dog.
I call it the shock collar approach. Like, not the collar, but just the fact of like, if it does something wrong, I'm yelling, right? And it doesn't work with the dog. It especially doesn't work with the kids. And this is a really easy one to fall into. As we were prepping this lesson, every time I go through like this list of things to work on or pay attention, it's something different hits me that I need to work on. But in Shepherding a Child's Heart, I think where a lot of these came through, they talked through a lot of ineffective parenting things, and we wanted to hit on a few of those and how they play out in the practical way. So one, obviously, the quote-unquote, the shock collar approach. I think they classify it more like the I didn't turn out so bad, or kind of the punitive approach, where as parents, our punishment or discipline comes when we're at our wit's end. So the shout is something along the lines of like, I've had it up to here, like blah, 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 and then you go on your little monologue, right? Your tirade, and that list of offenses may include everything they've done from today, the past week, since birth, like whatever it is. Like, you might go there. So like, just think through these things as they come. We're not going to be perfect at this, but realize the messages that we're sending. When we go through that tirade, that is not, although we've talked about communication, that ain't communication, right? That's a one-way monologue of listing offenses, and you kind of see their eyes roll back and
They
then fall asleep,
always tune
right?
out, yeah.
Like, when we get there, like, it's easy to get there, but recognize that may not be an effective correction point. It's just you kind of unloading, verbal unload for you on a kid. There's the pop psychology mistake. I call it the Instagram special, which is like you're parenting by just pure joy and rewarding the good behavior, right? You're like looking for everything. Do this and you'll get a reward. Do this and we'll keep your allowance intact. And I'm not saying those things are never useful in parenting, but be mindful of the message overall that's sending. We talked about obedience out of trust and love. We don't want to set up like, you obey because at the end of the day, the reward is better for you.
You get a sticker and an ice cream.
Yeah. So
There's
again,
a place for that, but
not saying that it's never useful, but if that is only your go-to, be mindful of that. That is the pattern that you're creating. Like, you're doing good for your own benefit, right? We don't want to set that up. Heather mentioned the emotionalism. Like, it's easy to get in the emotionalism pattern where when you correct or you have the conversation, that entire conversation is centered around your personal feelings and how the offense made you feel. Like, you made dad sad when you did that, or you didn't study for that test, and I paid a lot of money for that extra math tutor, and now it's all wasted. Like, that's my, again, not saying those aren't helpful things to bring up, but be mindful if that tirade is the use for your parenting, the structure, or what you're driving towards. There's the punitive method, where this is an easy one to fall into, of like, you're just basically, when something annoys you enough, you just lay down some random consequence, right? Which is like, all right, I've had enough, you smarted off to your mom, no video games for the next week. No conversation, and it can be abrupt. Not saying, again, grounding is not ever useful or pulling things away, but just acknowledgement. Like, once you've gone there and you laid that down, it's hard to have some conversation about what that means and what you're going for. The other piece to that is it's often the easiest, right? Like, it's really easy to just be like, bam, here it is, here's your consequence, live with it. So again, useful, especially as they get older, but be mindful of the downside of that, is that you can skip conversation. Your kid can really get used to living without whatever you're taking away as their go-to.
it's often
and just forgetting
unrelated
about
to
it.
their offense anyway.
Yeah. I think we'll talk a little more about natural consequences, but there may be times when that works more effectively if it's natural. Like, okay, when mom was talking to you, you didn't quit playing the video game. You were focused in on that. We need to talk through that your mom is more important than your video game. And then, that may be a more effective way to dole out something like that. But I think also in that there's the possibility of just being erratic, of like, you may go to any one of these phases at any given time. It's kind of hard to predict for your kids, like where you're going to go. So again, not saying none of those things are good in context, but think through some of the pitfalls if you're kind of laying in any one of those zones, or the extra communication that you need to have with your kids to work through them. If you kind of put some of those into just a straight example of like, okay, young kid has a little school lesson they need to do, and they're not doing it. So, you could lay down and say the bribery approach will be, well, if you do this, we'll go to the game this weekend. Again, not necessarily an awful thing, but pay attention to what that signifies and what it means. We talked through like following through. Well, if you say your reward is we're going to the ball game, are you really going to take that off the table and not go to the ball game if they don't do the homework? Are you going to wind up every single day 3 times reminding them, do this, I told you to do this, or you can't go to the game. I told you to do this, I can't go to the game. I told you to do. To that point, again, it's becoming an ineffective method.
Yeah, I'll say, like, it is common for us to fall into all of these at some point. They probably feel like, oh golly, they hit home at this. But what we're seeking to do is to have, for our parenting and our discipline to be characterized by discipline that's effective and biblical and out of obedience. And so if you go, well, I certainly do that thing, I did that thing yesterday, but what is our pattern? What are our kids expecting? What are they seeing regularly, I guess?
Yeah. So I want to keep moving on. I think we can give that example. We've kind of hit it. Shepherding a child's heart, I think, really lays out some of those pitfalls well, for just things that you may use and patterns that we might fall into as parents, where we're like, we're relying on that and we're missing some of the conversation piece, and can lead into some difficulties down the road.
Yeah, as far as books go, this is a quick side note. I have consulted a ton of books, even books that I hadn't picked up in 10 or 12 years, just to honestly to get my brain back into little kid space, to think through like what were the challenges then and what did we hold to. Anytime after class, if you need a resource, I'd be happy to chat through those things with you. We did not fully base this class on any one resource, just the Bible, okay? All right. All right, so before we move on, let's kind of pause and summarize where we've been. So we're looking for discipline that relies on consistency and clarity. We want to be clear with how we're communicating to our kids. If they don't know their expectation and just get corrected upon our annoyance, then that is going to create a kid that is provoked to anger, as we see in Ephesians 6. Frustration. Our kids are going to be frustrated. When our correction comes out of anger, it is fruitless in their lives. So we make sure that our kids understand our expectations clearly. Here are some practical tips for what has worked for me. First, we make sure that we communicate what's expected of them clearly up front. I'll go into an example in a second. It's helpful to have your kids repeat that back to you, because maybe they're not actually listening. They sometimes don't. Hey, I just told you we're going to go into the grocery store. The expectation is that you hold onto the cart and you don't run away from the cart while we're in the grocery store. What are you going to do while we're in the grocery store? Yes, it takes a couple extra minutes. It is so helpful. And they'll say, I hold on to the cart when we go in. You may practice, right? This may be, if this is a pressure point for your kid, whatever the situation is, you might practice at home. Today we're going to go to a friend's house for a play date. They have treats on their kitchen counter, and we're going to eat lunch when we leave. You're going to be really tempted to ask for those treats, but I would like you not to ask for the treats. Are you going to ask for the treats at their house? Nope, because we're going to have lunch after. I'm not going to ask for the treats. Okay, well, let's pretend. Let's walk into the kitchen and pretend like there are treats on the counter. Show me how you're going to show self-control. It sounds silly. It's helpful. They love it, especially in these tiny, tiny years. Have them practice. Lastly, Tell them what will happen if they choose disobedience. We will be at this friend's house for a play date. If you are not helpful with picking up toys as you go, or whatever it is, if you're unkind to your friend, we will have to leave, right? We will leave their house. And in that moment, you say, hey, I told you, if you were unkind to your friend, we would need to leave. Maybe you warn one more time. Maybe you just leave. So we make sure that we do not threaten a consequence if we are not prepared to back it up. Paul joked and said, if you tell the kids they throw a fit at Disney World, you better be prepared to put the mouse ears away and walk out if they do it. So, because they will learn from that. They'll know, I actually can get away with it just fine. And so many times, those are bigger consequences for us than they are for our kids. I don't want to leave this play date. I need this time with this other parent, But we have to make sure we follow through with what we say. That's what builds trust with our kids. So yeah, if we make sure, especially when they're small, that we are prepared to follow through, even if it's inconvenient.
Yeah, and that's not to say, you have to leave the fun thing. It's just saying, if you're not going to, then don't threaten.
Don't say it. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
All right, so to pull it all together, drawing together the communication piece and the rod. I mean, this is what we see laid out in Proverbs, is the back and forth, talking about the relationship between communicating with our kids, but also not sparing the rod. And that's some strong language that I read earlier in Proverbs. Like, whoever spares the rod hates his son. Like, that's some strong drops, right? And the conversation piece, to get down to kind of the nitty gritty on that, when we have these moments, interactions with our kids, when they need correction, I encourage you, think about the gospel piece of this, right? And we'll start there and say, how amazing it is that Jesus came down to earth, saw the world through our eyes, right? Like that the God of the universe saw and understands what we went through, right? There's a piece of this for us in seeking to understand what our kids are thinking and going through as we have issues of correction. So, if you're dealing with fighting a lot, sibling interactions, and again, we're gearing this towards younger years as we have this, but you're dealing with fights in between them, and they have a moment where they're fighting with a sibling over a toy, one yanks it away, throws it a fit in anger. There's some points you can pull aside and have the conversation. Ask some questions to understand where your kid is, what they're feeling. So, all right, if you sit down and you ask why questions, all right, and I know all of us have done this. If you say, why on earth did you just talk back to your mom like that and think it's okay? What is your kid going to say 100% of the time? I don't know. That's 100% of the time the answer you're going to get when you ask the why question. So try to think of some other ways to get at an understanding of what's going on. So we'll ask about okay, when your sister took that toy, and you got mad and yanked it out of her hands and started screaming, what were you feeling? What were you feeling when that happened? Get them to say things like, well, that was mine and she took it and I wanted it then. Then that gives you an opportunity to do what we talked about earlier and say, okay, let's talk through that. It's okay that you got upset and got angry, but your reaction to that is not okay. That's not how we react when things don't go the way that we want them to. Gives you an opportunity to listen to where their heart is, hear from them, and then talk through, hey, this is the other reaction to that. What did your sister do to make you mad? Get the heart piece and understand. Then you can talk and address, hey, that is a selfish attitude. That is sinful. All right. And for us, again, we don't do this every single time. You don't have time to do it every single time. But think about when you have some of these, and especially for us, we marked early on, if we're at home and this stuff happens, we need to go through the full thing at home, knowing that it may be in public later and we don't have time to go through the whole routine. But make use of the time you got when you're in the house and stop what you're doing, have the full combo, the why. We will do a lot of a role play in this conversation, and and we'd never called it that way before, but to say like,
I do. Yeah.
but like, I'm not going to monologue how that interaction should go for you. Like, I'm going to say, okay, next time your sister takes that toy, instead of yanking it out of her hand and pushing her to the ground, what do you think you should have done? What was a different reaction you could have had for that? Well, I could have said, hey, that's mine. Can I have it back now? And then we'll bring the other sibling over and say, let's talk through this and make them verbalize it. And I think there's a lot of value in that because, again, if you monologue it, they don't remember it, right?
Yeah. I mean, the truth is sometimes they just don't have the language to communicate in that moment. Like, you took my toy and I think I deserve to get it back. They just can't do it, especially when they're tiny. And so we have to give them the language to do that. We definitely role played these things a lot when they were little. I'm going to embarrass myself here, but I might even like stand behind one of the kids and be their voice, like they're my puppet, you know? And I'm like, oh, you took my toy. And I'm making them say it. They repeat it after me, and then it's like a funny thing. And it becomes fun to handle that situation appropriately. I'll say, especially when they're little, and Paul said to address things at home as much as you can. When they're tiny, any time distance from their offense will cause them to lose the association of the discipline to the offense, if that makes sense. So we make sure that our addressing it is immediate, if possible. It's a little bit like your dog, right? Your dog did this thing, and if you wait 10 minutes and address the dog, they don't know what they did wrong, and it's random. The same really is true with our little kids. You know, they're reaching for something hot. Now, that may not be a discipline moment, but you get the point. We have to address it right then so that they know exactly what we are talking about.
And yeah, I think you say that, we do it for our young kids. We've also had to do it with our older kids, like just straight up. Like there are times when you're like, hey, we're going to rewind that. And I'll say, one of the things that's awesome about Buck Run is we've rewound the conversation with a few adults in the lobby. And people have been down with it, like, hey, hold on, I apologize to you. My son was goofing off while you were asking them how they're doing today.
Can we try that again?
Would you permit them to try that again? And so I love the fact that we've got other parents, other grandparents, adults in the church we can do that with. But, you know, we've rewound it with the older ones too, because part of me, I want to set the expectation of, hey, if you mess up, it's not just going to be like, oh, I messed up, move on. Like, yeah, you get that sometimes. Sometimes it's like, I want to teach the lesson that if you did it wrong the first time, you're going to do it again and do it the right way. So you could choose to do it the right way out of the gate. Save us all a little time.
Yeah, and it's not to embarrass our kids in that moment. You know, you come back and you say, hey, let's talk about why we needed you to redo that. That person is created in God's image as well. That person is valuable, and the way you communicated with them did not make them feel important. So that's why we try that again, you know, and then we praise it when they do it well.
Yeah. So that's the communication piece, especially geared at when in the younger years. For our house, our primary method of consequence was a spanking. That was the role we went to primarily. And again, you know, sometimes some timeout, really trying to rely on natural consequences. So sometimes timeout things, sometimes going without things, you know, using other methods. But the primary for direct disobedience in our house was a spanking. And I think we laid out some case where scripturally we see reference to the rod frequently in parenting. And for us, I think we saw clearly, and we sat in a class just like this, and it really made us think, and when we hadn't been thinking about what the primary consequence in our house would be, it really made us think about it and go, because culturally right now, that is very, very offensive in a lot of circles. A lot of circles would just straight out say anything physical on that front is abuse. But I want to say a few things about the spanking piece. We're just gonna meet it head on. I'll just you pull the whiteboard over in just a second. So we, you know, for a lot of reasons, we're gonna get real with what happens in our house. I'm just gonna lay it out and go there. I'm pretty private anyway. Even randomly recording these makes me a little uncomfortable. But you know, this lesson for the privacy of our kids, we're probably not gonna have it posted in full. So we'll pull the whiteboard over in a minute, just so that they know the time to cut a section of the video out. But
Yeah, we want to honor our kids in the way we discipline, not out of embarrassment, but just out of privacy. But also, we think it's so valuable for us to actually see, what do other parents do? When we heard this in this class years ago, maybe we had one newborn, and we honestly hadn't even talked about, like, were you spanked? Was I spanked? Are we going to do this? How are we going to handle this? What does it look like? What do other people actually do? And so that's what we're doing today.
Yeah, and I'll say right out of the gate, the things about spanking, one, it is immediate consequence. It can be very jarring. It's crystal clear. But in the big picture, it is a minor consequence. We have that conversation with our kids in our house. Hey, this is minor. I joked earlier about we talked through like, hey, you hit your sister, and we dealt with this. This consequence of a spanking seems huge in this moment. If I did that at my job, what would happen to me? Like, we talk about this is a minor consequence. Your consequences for your actions grow the bigger you get. And this is your place to fail. This can seem huge. It's not. So it's immediate, it's jarring, it's clear, it's minor, and it really lets you draw, like Heather said a moment ago, a very direct action to consequence. Like immediate, here was your action, and if you've been clear with your expectations, you've been clear with what happens when you fail to meet those expectations, your kids get pretty predictable and understanding, and you can have the conversation like, this was the expectation, this is where you fell short, this is my role to administer this consequence to you. And then my favorite thing about it is that reconciliation then comes immediately, right? Like there is a very clear, that was your consequence is over, we're reconciled, I love you, let's move on with our day, you are forgiven, let's move on to the next thing.
Yeah, so you see how moments of discipline are a really unique opportunity to present the gospel in full to our kid. You sinned. There is separation in that. There is always a sting with sin. There is always a consequence, even though in life you may not see it right away. This is how restoration can occur. So I remind you that there is a sting in sin, and then I provide reconciliation. We point to Christ. We restore relationship, and we move on without grudges. That's a choice we have to make as parents. Like, you acted an absolute fool in there, and I'm going to try to not act like you did that all day long. But it is important that we do it.